Where they do celebrity birthdays. And I always laugh because whenever they're doing celebrity birthdays, usually one of the other hosts will pipe up about maybe somebody, they don't like their music, or what have they been doing for a while, or whatever. And the other host will always remark when they say, especially when they say something negative, he goes, "Or you mean happy birthday," right? Because sometimes we do that, right? We start saying things, and what we really should be saying is something else. Sometimes the word we're saying really should be pronounced differently, or maybe the opposite. What we're saying, we're really saying in such a way that it means something totally different. There's a word in the English language that's very powerful, no. But it's a word a lot of people have trouble pronouncing. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 37, Jesus tells us, "Let your statement be yes, yes, and your no, no, and anything beyond is of the evil one." The context of this passage, Jesus is talking about those who feel compelled to make oaths. They make oaths because people don't believe what they're going to say, so they have to make an oath in order to emphasize it. Jesus says we don't need to do that. We just need to mean what we say and say what we mean. Our yes to be yes, our no to be no. James copies and says the same thing in James chapter 5, verse 12. "Above all, brethren, do not swear either by heaven or earth or by any other oath. Let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under judgment." Notice in the end of both of these passages, just so you don't fall under judgment, anything else is evil. There's an idea there that when we say something and we don't mean it, then we have a problem. But what about it comes to time when we need to say no? We've been studying this month about being fruitful with our time. How we need to make sure that we are redeeming the time, that we're using our time wisely, that we're not wasting times in things that we shouldn't do, that we're not being so caught up being busy with everything, as we talked about this morning, that we forget to do what's most important. But in order to do that, there are times when we have to say no to something. And that can be very difficult for us. We know that saying yes to everything is a recipe to disaster. If somebody tells us to do something we know is harmful to us and we agree, it can ruin us. The same thing is true that if we overextend ourselves, we won't be able to do it all. And saying yes to everything means we won't be saying something that's true. But it's hard to say no, at least without feeling guilty to someone. When somebody's looking at you and they need you to do something and you just have to say no, we don't like that. But no can be a complete sentence. We have to know that not everything is a good idea will be good for you, or not every good idea will be a God idea. And so we have to learn to make the most of our time. And that comes to sometimes when we have to say no. When you say no to the wrong things for you, you're giving yourself an opportunity to say yes to the right things. So how can we learn to say no and to say it correctly? Today I want to look at 4 ways we might be saying no incorrectly, so that we can learn how to say no correctly and yes correctly. Because sometimes our yes is actually no. We say yes, but we really mean no. I experience this a lot of times when I used to do door knocking and set up Bible studies. You'd just knock somebody's door, you invite them to study, they'd agree, you'd set a time and date. You'd show up for that time and date, they wouldn't be there. You'd call back, you'd go back, you'd catch the person again. You say, "Do you still want to study?" "Oh, yes, I want to study." "What time do you want to do it?" "We'll set up a time and date." We go back and they're not there. And you do this a couple of times and you finally say to yourself, "What's going on here?" Well, as one lady told me, she said, most people can't say no to you, especially when they know it's something they need to do straight to your face. So it's much easier to say yes and then later just not do it. We do that in our homes in the world, right? We do that with our children. We say yes, but we really mean no. Our bosses do that to us sometimes. They agree, "Oh, yeah, you can do that," but then they put every roadblock in the way to keep you from doing it. And you think, well, why didn't they just tell me no if they didn't want me to do it? Because sometimes our yes is no. We are wishy-washy. We vacillate. That's what Paul was being accused of when he talks in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 17. He says, "Therefore I was not vacillating when I intended to do this, was I? Or for what purpose did according to the flesh? Was it me that there was a yes and a no at the same time? Paul is saying here, I wasn't giving you contradictory message saying yes and no and yet. He said, I was being very clear with what I was doing. That can be confusing for people if we say things and we don't really mean it. That's what Jesus was talking about when he told us to let our yes be yes and our no be no. Mean what we say and mean it enough to do it. You see, sometimes our yes is actually no because we say it with no real intent of follow through. And that's a very dangerous thing for us to be doing. Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and verses 4 through 6 tells us, when you make a vow to God, do not be late in paying it, for he takes no delight in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow than you should vow and not pay it. Do not let your speech cause you to sin, and do not say in the presence of the messenger of God that it was a mistake. Why should be God angry with you on account of your voice and destroy the work of your hands? If you're going to say something, especially when you say it to God, you better let your yes mean yes, and make sure that your yes isn't a no, because in doing so, you're setting yourself up for a worse fate. Sometimes we want to make sure our yes is not a no. But other times we want to make sure that our no is not a yes. What do I mean by that? We say no, but eventually if you keep asking, we'll switch. We say no, but there's a question mark at the end of it, right? No, but you can push me a little bit, maybe I will. I think my favorite example of this in the scriptures is in the story of Samson. In Judges chapter 16, we see Samson when Delilah was trying to find out the secret of his great strength. And she would come to him and she would sweet talk him and she would beg him to tell him the strength, and he'd come up with some story and tell her, and lo and behold, sure enough, the Philistines would try it on him. But since it wasn't the real reason, Samson would escape. You think Samson would have caught on what was going on there, because every time he told Delilah something, it was going to happen to him. But the text tells us in verse 16, it came about that she pressed him daily with her words and urged him that his soul was annoyed to death, and he told her all that was in his heart, and he said to her, and he goes on to tell her the source of his strength. He had said he wasn't, he'd not been telling her, but now she presses him, and finally he just gives in. We might be willing to sit there and say with Samson, well, that was a one-time thing. Delilah was really... she just got to him. But you know what? It's not. You go back to Samson's first wife in Judges chapter 14. The woman that he saw who was among the Philistines, that she looked good enough for him, so he wanted to marry her, even though his parents said it's a bad idea. So he goes and marries her, and on the day of his wedding, he makes a bet with he comes up with a riddle and makes a bet with some of his in-laws that they'll pay him some money if they can't figure out his riddle, which they can't. So they get to his wife and they say, get him to tell you the answer. She tries to press him, and he says, I hadn't even told my parents. Why would I tell you? But once again, it says she prodded him. In verses 16 and 17, she said, you only hate me and do not love me. You have propounded a riddle to the sons of my people, and you haven't told me. Later it said she wept for 7 days while the feast lasted. On the seventh day he told her, because she pressed him so hard. And then she told her people. See, Samson was one of those people that wasn't going to tell. But if he kept pushing, he would. Because his no was actually a yes. Maybe we're the same way. We say we're going to say no, and maybe we even do say no. But all it takes is a little pressure, a little pushing, and then we fold. Maybe we don't mean what we say. Much like when our yes is no, our no can be yes, it can be come through because we're not concerned about keeping the truth. But Colossians 3:9 tells us, do not lie to one another, since you have laid aside the old self with its evil practices. As a Christian, lying is something we have to put behind us. It's not something we can do casually or easily just to kind of make things easier. We have to tell the truth. Some lies are born lies, and some lies become lies. Some lies come out of our mouth, we know it's a lie. Some of them, when they come out of our mouth, we think they're not going to be, but they eventually become one. When our no becomes a yes, it's a lie that becomes a lie. That's why we need to be careful when we do say something that we truly mean it, or we can find ourselves in judgment. But sometimes our no isn't no and our yes isn't no, but our no is, as I said, always. What do I mean by that? The answer is always no, right? It's true we have to learn how to say no, but we need to remember we shouldn't say no for just the sake of saying no. Jan this morning, she got on me and she said, I appreciate the lesson you're going to do tonight about saying no. She said, but I got the food committee this month and you got me really scared because I'm going to be calling people and they'll say no. That's what we worry about, right? But sometimes we fall into the habit of our no is always. When everything comes up, we just say no. And it's not a considered no, it's just a standard no. Our quick response is no. You see, saying no is not inherently selfish. Saying no isn't inherently evil. Saying no is not inherently unkind until it is. You see, if we just say no always to everything, we may be doing so very selfishly. We say no because we're only considering ourselves. We may be saying no because we want to get to somebody. We want to make it hard on somebody else. We may be saying no because we don't care or consider anyone else. That kind of no isn't correct. You know, sometimes in an organization you hear the phrase, it's easier to get forgiveness than it is permission. Heard that before? What does that mean? It means if we try to go and ask, we won't get anything. But if we just do it, they'll get over it and we can get the thing that we need to do. And that's a problem. It's a problem in how we approach authority, but it's also a problem with how authority is reacting. If people can't do something that's good and necessary without hearing no, then there might be a problem. We might be saying no too much. No can be the right thing to say, but no can also be a wrong thing to say if we say it always. Consider 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verses 1 through 3. Here, Paul talks about those who are falling away from the faith, a very thing we wouldn't want to do, right? Those who are paying attention to deceitful spirits and the doctrines of demons. Well, this obviously is something bad, right? Somebody who's in danger of losing their soul, somebody who's listening to demons and their doctrines. And he gives two examples of what he's talking about. The first one is by those who forbid marriage and those who advocate abstaining from foods. Do you notice that those two things he uses as an example are no? No, you can't do that. No, you can't participate in that. The no here is as wrong would get. Saying no here, well, you can't do that. That's wrong. When it wasn't, was a doctrine of a devil. No shouldn't be always. Sometimes we think no is the safe alternative, right? We'll say no because we don't know. Just to be safe. But you realize that saying no is not as safe as we might think? When we say no always, then we're not considering what we should actually be saying no to and what we should be saying yes to. James 4:17 tells us, therefore the one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin. Do you realize that? Oftentimes we make the mistake of thinking sin is only things we go out and do. Well, I haven't done anything, so I haven't sinned. Not according to James. If you know the thing you're supposed to do, if you know the thing that's right and good and you're not doing it, it is sin. That's why we have to be careful that our no isn't always. Because if we're always saying no, we might be saying no to the things that we should be doing, and it can be sin. The flip side of that is when our no is never. Now, a few years ago, Daryl Davis did a wonderful Wednesday night devotional where he talked about how he made the decision at the first of the year that he was never going to say no to when somebody asked him to do something for the Lord. And man, I thought that was a great thought. When something is for the Lord, I am not going to say no. And I don't think that's a bad thought. But I also know that if you take that thought to everyone and every place, you might get yourself in a lot of trouble, right? It's a good idea never to say no to the Lord, but it can be a terrible idea not to say no to everything else. But sometimes we feel that pressure to say yes because we think about the example of Jesus, right? We see Jesus as someone who was sacrificing and loving and caring, and we want to be like him. And that can be a very good and healthy idea, but we also need to think about how Jesus responded in some situations. We're not always going to meet every need. Not everything is our responsibility. We can't care for every person. We can't take advantage of the opportunities we can if we're saying yes to everything else. As we talked about last week with Jesus, there were times when Jesus set his priorities, understood his purpose, right? I got to go somewhere else because I was called to preach. There were things people wanted him to do, and there were good things, but he had to say no to it in order to do the best thing. If we say yes to everything, we'll end up like we talked about this morning, exhausted, empty, overextended, and bitter. So busy with everything, we really do nothing. Think of it this way. If you go to a restaurant and you get in line and there's this big, long buffet, right? And there's all kinds of food and just about everything on that buffet you like, and you get your plate and you start loading it up. And you start putting some chicken, and you start putting some brisket, and you start putting some mashed potatoes and some baked potatoes and some French fries and whatever other kind of potato you can think of. And you get to that. The longer you go, especially if they gave you one of those flimsy paper plates, what's going to happen? You're going to get about halfway through, and that thing's going to buckle, and boom, it's going to hit the floor. And what are you left with? Nothing. Because you can't put everything on there without it collapsing. In the same way, we have to think about if our no is never, then eventually everything will collapse and we'll get nothing. That's why we have to be considered in what we say yes to and considered in what we say no to. Proverbs chapter 25 verse 28 says, like a city that is broken into without walls is a man who has no control over his spirit. In the ancient world, the city walls were what protected the city, right? It kept out invaders. It controlled the flow of people in and out. When we look at the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah desires to build a wall for that city. Why? Because he knows without a wall, the city's going to fall apart because it won't be distinctive. It won't be able to protect itself. It won't be able to control itself. You got to have a wall. And proverb here says if a city that has broken walls, it's like a city that's broken into without walls is a man with no control. In other words, if we don't put up some barriers to make sure we are in control of ourselves, we will be broken and we will be overrun. There are boundaries that we have to set. There are things that we have to say yes to because they're right, and there are things that we have to say no to. If our no is never, we'll eventually be overrun, and our spirit will be crushed. Because every yes is a no. Every yes we say to something is keeping us from doing something else, right? It keeps us from other things. So when we say yes to this thing, it's going to limit some other thing. Because physically we can't do it all. The plate will collapse. It'll fall over. We'll burn out. And every no we say is actually a yes. Maybe not to that thing, but to something else. When we say no, it gives us a chance to do something else. If we are never saying no, we are saying no to a great many things. Not by choice, but by default. See, we have to say no to those because we can't ever get to them. And Satan loves to give us a default choice, right? He'll give us so much stuff to do that we can never say yes to the things that we need to do. If you read the book of Psalms, you'll notice a couple of times Psalms repeat. That's because the book of Psalms was actually 4 books that were combined into one. 2 of the Psalms that repeat are Psalms 14 and Psalms 53. They both start with the very same line, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." A fool says in his heart there is no God, and it goes on to say that because of that, he just kind of does whatever he wants, whenever he wants, because he's not worried about judgment. He's not worried about any repercussions. He's just concentrated on the here and now. What's interesting about that passage is when we think about that, we think of an atheistic mindset, right? The fool that says there is no God. But when you read that in the original language, it almost reads, the fool has said into his heart, no God. And that kind of changes how we think of it, right? It's not just there is no God, but it's also no to God. That we're saying, no God. No God, so no consideration. No God, so no priorities. No God, so just do whatever you want. That's what a fool thinks. Wise man knows that there is a God, and we shouldn't probably be saying no to God. Because if we say no to God, we're saying no to the one who truly cares for us and wants what's best for us and knows where we need to be and what we need to be doing. You see, if we're saying yes to everything, we'll end up saying no to God. That's why we have to learn how to say no correctly. We say no to the things of the world. If we say yes to God but don't do what he tells us to do, are we really saying yes to God? If we say no to sin but we do it anyway, are we still really saying no to sin? Even when we should say yes, we say no, are we really doing the things of God? And if we say yes to everything, can we really be saying yes to him? See, we need to learn how to say no to the things of the world. No to the things that lead us away from our Lord. Yes to the things that he wants us to do. Yes to the way that would have us to go. But we can only say yes to those things if we strengthen ourselves, set our boundaries, and commit to making sure that we know how to say no. Is there something in your life today that you've been saying yes to that you know you shouldn't? Some activity, some thought, some way. You know it leads to destruction. You know it leads to heartache, but it's just too hard to say no. Is there something that you should be saying yes to, but you keep living no to? Maybe it's the Lord. Maybe it's his invitation to become his child. Maybe it's no to the commands that he gives you in regard to salvation. I can tell you the worst person you can say no to is God. You can say no to your friends. You can say no to your family. You can even say no to your spouse. And it may not be a bad thing. But I can tell you every time you say no to God, it hurts you in ways you can't imagine. So let's say no to the things that we need to say no to and say yes to the things that we do. When Jesus offers you an invitation to come, it's something that you should say yes to. And if you're ready to respond to that invitation tonight, we offer it to you right now while we stand and sing.